Hello, I'm Wolf,
Hello, I'm AChicken.
and we're the founders of the Glacorian development team. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about us, please check out our first episode of the Q&A series where we introduce ourselves, our hobbies, our professions, and why we want to share the story of the Glacorian universe with everyone.
If you're not familiar with our setting, we also talked a little bit about it in our first episode as well, and shown some light on it in our second episode too.
As we mentioned in that episode just past, we have been hard at work on our better vanilla mod for Stellaris that integrates and includes some of the stories from our Glacorian universe into the game. And we have a second announcement to make today following the conduction of our open alpha test.
The mod is now stable and available for everyone on the Steam Workshop as an open beta. It is completely up to date with 4.0 and later versions of the game. If you're a fan of Stellaris, or a fan of the setting and would like to interact with the setting in a more in-depth way, the link for our mod will be included in the description of this video, along with the trailer for it. Our Patreon and our Discord community link where you can communicate more directly with us and engage in other community activities.
With that said, and without further ado, let's get into some of today's Q&A questions.
The first question for today comes from longtime Discord community member Duckaboo, and he asks, how is expansion by the Glacorian Shogunate done, generally speaking, and how are quote-unquote borders determined?
So, space being space makes it extremely difficult to have a clear line in the sand sort of border. Instead, typically, borders would be more amorphous. In the case of shared systems, borders would be extremely fluid due to the nature of planets and their orbits. This would force kind of a defense in-depth focus on defending areas of importance.
Because of this, enforcing a quote-unquote border would require constant patrolling, listening posts, and an acceptance of the fact that a determined attacker could travel far enough above or below the galactic plane to circumvent those patrols and listening posts. For this reason, most likely, hostile factions that were close to each other would constantly be fighting because of the difficulty of determining their actual border.
Except in the case of open hostility, border enforcement between unfriendly factions would likely manifest in the kind of enforcement that the modern mechanized and nuclear powers of India and China are currently, where they agree to only use martial arts with just a few key personnel armed with archaic melee weapons patrolling the quote-unquote no man's land in groups of 50 or more. I'm sure the less scrupulous hostile faction would always honor that agreement and never behave dishonorably, right? Right?
We have no examples of this happening in reality, do we?
No, never.
Our second question for today's episode comes from Discord community member Am Kirkla, who joined the community after enjoying our Stellaris mod in its early stages. The question here is, did the USH have any major armed conflicts between its founding crusade and Glacorian's insurrection?
So, between the end of the NSUG, the New Standard United Government, and the USH, or the United Strength of Humanity Crusade, in 2258, and at the start of the Glacorian Insurrection in 2352, between those two times, the USH did not have any singular major armed conflicts, though there were absolutely a few hurdles they had to overcome to rein in the recently conquered and kind of disunified human colonies. For example, in 2271, there was a large pushback, civil pushback against the USH's ever-increasing and overbearing centralization efforts, but things like police funding and re-education camps, a la the Soviet Union's KGB, eventually saw a massive crackdown on this unrest before the end of 2298. Small-scale armed conflicts were a part of this, as people resisted the USH's tyranny, but disharmonious rebel groups were unable to gain massive footholds before the might of the United Strength of Humanity military-industrial complex. And we now have another question from Duckaboo, kind of further expanding on his question from before. He says, one would think with the quote-unquote big stick of the Shogunate that the various disputes regarding territory, etc., with any other power, considering the many border territories or planets, would be easily resolved in the Shogunate's citizens' favor. Or is this not the case?
Alright, so this is actually going to be a little bit longer of an answer. But in disputes regarding existing colonies where another power claims they own the colony while it currently resides in Glacorian territory, keeping in mind the Shogunate doesn't undertake aggressive invasions of other powers, so any such colonies would have to have been first colonized by humanity, or at least long abandoned by any other power. In these cases, the Shogunate would indeed leverage its big stick powers in favor of its colonists' interests. It's worth noting that this would almost always mean that being human in the Glacorian Shogunate meant you enjoyed certain implied benefits more than the alien, because nearly every Glacorian Shogunate colonist would be human. Humanity's government was obviously made by humans, and thus would naturally, at an implicit level, favor humanity over the alien. If this wasn't the case, then this would necessarily be anti-human, and thus antithetical to a human-founded government.
When push comes to shove, I guess the Shogunate's quote-unquote big stick comes in the form of an armed and trained local population, which makes invasions far more expensive than the defensive costs are. So the big stick is more a warning that trying to take colonies from the Shogunate is going to be extremely hard, and that the other power would be better off not trying.
It's like a home invasion where people are disarmed is normally safer than a home invasion where people are generally armed.
Yeah, I mean, you open that front door, get blasted by a shotgun, you're certainly not going back.
No, that's true. To be clear, the Shogunate arguably has a more liberal, as in freedom, so classically liberal, stance towards weaponry ownership than some of the modern pro-weapon ownership and use states in the contemporary world. Colonies, even individual colonists, owning surface-to-orbit nuclear-tipped weaponry is, while not common, in part because it's so expensive, technically permitted within the Glacorian Shogunate. In fact, such weaponry has played a vital role, including civilian weaponry, in the defense of the Glacorian Shogunate, even as far back as in the universe's lore as Jade Rozek's exploits during the Great Cathorian War against the First Creed.
In the matter of disputes about colonies that have not yet been established, the Shogunate generally does not argue about those kinds of matters and looks for peaceful alternatives instead.
Our next question is actually one that I had for Wolf while we were discussing some development items internally, but I figured that it would interest our viewers to know this as well, considering it's going to play a role in the games, stories, and media that we produce about our setting. That question is, what nomenclature does the Glacorian Shogunate use to name its hardware, especially military hardware? For example, the United States military has the Apache attack helicopter, which would basically be tribe function type. The M1A1 Abrams main battle tank would effectively be officer function type. Would the Glacorian Shogunate use something like, say, the C2T3 Jade assault tank, which would be combat variant 2, tank type 3, Jade assault tank?
So, the Glacorian Shogunate leans towards utilitarian keywords to outline the purpose of each weapon system when naming them respectively. A prominent example of this in our content is handheld firearms and weaponry available to players throughout our TTRPG adaptation and also tabletop wargames. However, in the case of vehicles, the nomenclature is the general role of the tank, of the vehicle or tank as you asked, then the process by which it achieves that role, followed by any variations that may be present, and then the model number. So in the case of one of the heaviest and most recent tanks fielded by the Glacorian Shogunate, its title is GV-CLT Mark 1, which stands for Ground to Void Coil Launcher Tank. Another example of this nomenclature is the Ground Combat Heavy Caliber Tank 125mm Mark II, or GC-HCT 125 Mark II. Normally, the ground combat heavy caliber tank Mark II sports a 170mm cannon, but in that example, it's been retooled to carry the large caliber 125mm cannon instead. But that was a really good question. The nomenclature has been something that I've been kind of working on, revamping over the last 10 years. It certainly wasn't something that I designed at the start of our project, and or my project at the time. And I've been able to solidify it as I've come together with you and worked on the setting. Good. It's kind of been cemented.
Good. I'm gonna have to think of how the Liderans name their equipment, and also what kind of equipment they're gonna have, because they would have a very different style than the contemporary, or I guess stereotypical human heavy tank kind of style, or heavy infantry.
I know that you worked on the naming system for their planets, and a lot of their less militarily focused developments.
Yes.
And for those of you with a keen eye, that's actually available in our mods files, so you can go have a look at that.
In the localization under name, I think it's localization or nameless, something like that. I put in comments the naming schema for habitat, so like basically civilian spaceborne star bases, for their planets, for their names, their people, the islands, and it's all there's a whole, you can actually tell from someone's name, you can tell based on their gender. If I remember off the top of my head, I'll have to refresh my memory. Based on their gender, you can tell who their mother is, what the island is, what their family name is, because most of the name is island, mother's name, and family name. And I think women adopt their middle name, if I remember correctly, is the mother's name, and men, it's the island they're from that's their middle name.
Their middle name.
I think
but
that's how it
their
is.
first name includes their mother's name?
Yes, I think so. Or maybe it was the last name that is the mother's name. I forget. I just remember mothers played a huge role in that because of the exceptionally low birth rate of Liderans. So the act of giving birth was almost religious, more so than it would be for humans to Liderans.
It's almost a matrilineal worship sort of culture, not literal worship.
Yeah, not in like godhood, but in the sense of reverence.
Highly venerated,
I guess.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, low birth rate. So a low birth rate with very long lifespans. So someone could go 200 years between their children, and they could only have one or two children sometimes. And a large Lideran family would be 3 children, for example. That would be very large. So that would be the equivalent of a human family of like 7 or 12 children, kind of thing.
Yeah,
and that's why they would grow so slow. And there'd be like 600 years between the oldest and the youngest. And speaking of the almost reverent or spiritual undertones of the naming, or that is also the names that I got for their systems herald back to, just like on Earth, it herald like Mars, Jupiter. These are all pantheonic names, come from some ancient pantheon. And it's similar in the light system. And I took like the sun. So you know how Earth is literally, it's just dirt. The name of Earth is just dirt. I took that for like the Liderans. The name of their sun is literally just light. That's it. It's light.
They have probably one of my favorite cultures in the setting. because it's so unique and detailed. Like, not in the sense that you have added lots of detail, but in the sense that they are focused on detail, and it's beautiful.
Yes.
And I'm really interested to see how that translates into weapons of war or weapons of protection, because there's less of a, I guess, it's less. War is not reverent. It can be done respectfully, but it's not. It is inherently irreverent.
Especially to a species that has such a low birth rate that the death of a single person would be a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really curious to see how the naming convention turns out for them for military weapons.
That actually makes me think of. So I'm reminded of our conversation about a potential. I don't think we've decided it's canonical yet, but a potential interaction between a human when the Glacorian Shogunate and Institute first meet, between the human delegation on Beacon, the homeworld of the Liderans, when they're shown different landmarks, and they're shown, here's our War of Unification Memorial, where we had massive, like, it was catastrophic levels of death, and they're like, there's like.
There's like 1,000 tombstones.
There's 1,000 tombstones here, so it must be like what one tombstone is like has a bunch of names on it, kind of thing, like we would have here at some memorials. And it's like, no, each tombstone is a single person. So like the Great War, the Great World War of this species, only 100 to 1,000 Liderans died, and it would be like. Yeah, over here is where our leaders. So Islander Lazier, it's Islander Damiotis Lazier. They would see like, there's these stones that have the last name Lazier on them.
Yeah.
And so like this stone has Damiotis on it. And so you could actually tell, this Islander probably knew this person. Islander was related to this person. Kind of thing,
and the humans are like, man, we have this many people on one tombstone.
Yeah, and that would have. We talked about how that would have been one of the eye-opening events of wow, this is a very different culture from humanity. The death of a single Lideran would be household conversation for the entire species of like just under 1 million, something like that at time of discovery. Yeah. So that, I'm gonna have to. You're right. I'm gonna have to do some thinking about how they would name their weaponry, how they would develop it, what sort of formalized what kind of military-industrial complex would they have? Or would it be... Because they're very artisanal focused, because they all specialize in multiple things. So would it be more like this family or this island uses this, that fills this niche, and then...
would they also focus...
Go ahead.
Would they also have a focus on non-lethal weaponry?
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing we've determined is they have far better... electronic countermeasures and electronic countermeasures, ECM and ECCM, which is basically quote-unquote cloaking. They have a much bigger focus on that, on the hiding and the discovery, so sensors, things like that, observation, and are more developed in that than humanity. Of course, some of that is just the fact that we're technologically advanced, but that also could be a result of a cultural thing of it's like, so they knew, for those that aren't familiar with the lore, the Institute knew of and interacted with the Gamolan Convocation before the Gamolans met with the Cathorians, and then watched as the Gamolans were exterminated. And the Gamolans, for their part, took the location of the Institute to their grave, as the species was made extinct. But that is the Lideran, like, conflict necessarily means loss of life, so it's preferable to avoid conflict, even if it means hiding, than it is to fight. And there was no way the Institute could have come out on top against the Cathorians without significant debilitating loss, and so which
it was a really good question.
Yeah, it was.
And
so I say, and I'm the one that asked it, LMAO.
Well, I'm really glad you did. It is a fantastic question. So to finish us off on our questions for today, after our discussion, our impromptu discussion of the Lideran culture, which I'm really looking forward to working on that a little bit more. To finish us off on our questions for today, we have another interesting one from Duckaboo. He says, how high is the level of piracy and activity of quote-unquote independent groups in the Glacorian Shogunate? So generally speaking, what is the state and power of crime within the Shogunate? He says, it is my understanding that the clans are powerful enough to have fleets and exert heavy influence on certain colonies, but how does that extend to general criminal dealings throughout the Shogunate and the power or influence of criminal enterprises other than the clans? Would their activities impact foreign relations?
So, at the moment, independent criminal groups sometimes use the clans as a gateway and umbrella to undertake their operations with a level of ease, as the clans offer them protection so long as the criminal group's activities align with their interests. However, association with any of the existing clans can cause an independent organization to have harsher penalties than their activities would otherwise warrant. So there are those that also steer clear of the clans. The Brunshaw gang of Gliese 1002 is an example of a crime organization that avoids clan entanglement. Considering that every citizen in the Shogunate is militarily trained and allowed to be equally equipped, certain kinds of violent crime, like robbery, become exceptionally difficult, but not impossible.
This would mean that traditional mafia-like activities, such as extortion, would be likely to rely on psychological and emotional attacks. You could picture this as sad puppy dog commercials begging for donations to such and such charlatan charity.
Which isn't to say that every charity like that is charlatan. However, it is definitely scammers. Even today, they target with internet, like email and fax and television. Scammers do use those psychological and emotional attacks, and have sad
you can say commercials. You can say, think of the children, and people will pay.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, that even works for not even criminal organizations. It works for legal organizations like governments.
Yep, sure does.
Oh, well. So outside of being able to form an actual militia capable of combating both the generally armed citizens, the Shogunate police, and the Shogunate military, violent crime is limited to insular issues like localized family feuds and gang wars at the very most, which as a result end up being short-lived when they do spring up. Any other scale of fighting is far too expensive both in money and in life, and the odds exponentially outmatched, which is why organizations interested in that scale of crime usually end up conglomerating with the clans.
Yeah. So those were some of the questions we've had sent to us through our Discord server. A link to the Glacorian Development Discord server, that server is in the description of this video. If you want to come check us out or get involved in the community, it's open to everyone. In addition, we will include a link to our Patreon for those interested in supporting our efforts.
If you have any questions or simply want to follow our progress as we develop media for this universe, please join our Discord. If you want to support our efforts and can afford it, consider our Patreon. Thank you for listening.